The year was 1983, and the world had never been closer to its final midnight. In Washington, D.C., President Ronald Reagan stood before the National Association of Evangelicals, his voice resonating with conviction as he called the Soviet Union an evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. His words weren't mere rhetoric. They represented the fundamental belief system of an administration that had abandoned the détente of previous years in favor of confrontation. The speech echoed through the marble halls of American power and reverberated across the Atlantic, reaching the ears of Soviet leadership already convinced that the West was preparing for war. In Moscow, the aging men of the Politburo listened to these translated words with mounting alarm. General Secretary Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB and now leader of the Soviet Union, was not a man prone to paranoia without cause. His intelligence networks had detected disturbing patterns: increased NATO military exercises, deployment of Pershing II missiles in West Germany, capable of reaching Moscow in minutes, and what Soviet analysts interpreted as preparation for a first strike. Andropov had even initiated Operation Ryan, an acronym for Raketno-Yadernaya Napadenia, or nuclear missile attack, ordering KGB stations worldwide to watch for signs of an impending American attack. The Cold War, which had simmered and occasionally boiled over for nearly 4 decades, had entered its most dangerous phase. Both superpowers possessed arsenals capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. The Americans had approximately 23,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviets had roughly 40,000. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, appropriately abbreviated as MAD, meant that any nuclear exchange would inevitably escalate into total annihilation. Yet paradoxically, this mutual vulnerability was supposed to guarantee peace. The theory went that no rational leader would launch a nuclear attack, knowing it would result in their own nation's destruction. But 1983 was testing the limits of that theory. Throughout that tense year, incidents piled upon incidents, each one ratcheting up the tension between the superpowers. In March, Reagan had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, immediately dubbed Star Wars by the media, a space-based missile defense system that threatened to upset the delicate balance of MAD. If America could shoot down Soviet missiles while the USSR couldn't retaliate effectively, the Soviets reasoned, what would stop the Americans from launching a first strike? Then came September 1st, and the incident that sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747 carrying 269 passengers and crew, strayed into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. Soviet air defense, on high alert and convinced the aircraft was an American spy plane, perhaps even on a mission to test Soviet radar defenses before a real attack, scrambled fighters. Su-15 interceptor pilot Major Gennady Osipovich fired 2 missiles, and the airliner plummeted into the Sea of Japan. All aboard perished, including U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald. The international outcry was immediate and fierce. Reagan called it an act of barbarism and a massacre. The Soviets, initially denying involvement, then claiming the aircraft was on a spy mission, appeared callous and trigger-happy to the world. But within the Kremlin, the incident reinforced Andropov's conviction that the Americans were probing Soviet defenses, testing response times, perhaps preparing for war. The shootdown wasn't seen as a tragic mistake, but as a necessary defensive action against American aggression. By November, tensions had reached a fever pitch. NATO was conducting its largest military exercise in years, Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to practice NATO's nuclear release procedures, the protocols for authorizing and launching nuclear weapons in response to a Soviet attack. For 10 days, from November 2nd to 11th, NATO forces across Europe would simulate transitioning from conventional to chemical to nuclear warfare, using new, more realistic procedures that included encrypted communications and radio silences that mimicked actual nuclear war protocols. To NATO commanders, it was a routine exercise, albeit an important one. To Soviet intelligence analysts, already primed by Operation Ryan to expect an attack, Able Archer 83 looked like something far more sinister, the perfect cover for an actual first strike. After all, the exercise involved the participation of top NATO leaders, including heads of government. Forces were being mobilized. Communications were being encrypted. Radio silences, exactly what you'd expect if NATO was preparing to launch a surprise attack, were being implemented. Soviet intelligence reported that NATO forces had been placed on heightened alert. Warsaw Pact forces responded in kind. Soviet nuclear forces quietly moved to increased readiness. In East Germany, Soviet aircraft were loaded with nuclear weapons, a highly unusual step during peacetime or exercises. The world was sliding toward the abyss, and most people on either side had no idea how close they were standing to the edge. This was the world into which Colonel Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov walked on the evening of September 26, 1983, 6 weeks before Able Archer would bring everything to a head. Petrov was not a typical military man. At 44 years old, with graying hair and thoughtful eyes behind thick-framed glasses, he looked more like a university professor than a colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. Indeed, his expertise lay not in commanding troops or flying aircraft, but in computer systems and algorithms. He was a software engineer in uniform, one of the engineers who had helped develop the very system he now monitored. His workplace was Serpukhov 15, a secret command bunker located in the town of Serpukhov, about 60 miles south of Moscow. The installation was so classified that it didn't appear on any maps. To the outside world, it didn't exist. Even within the Soviet military, knowledge of the bunker was compartmentalized. Only those who worked there, or had explicit need to know, were aware of its location and purpose. Inside Serpukhov 15, deep underground, protected by meters of concrete and steel, was the nerve center of the Soviet Union's early warning system, OKO, Russian for I. The OKO system consisted of a constellation of satellites in geostationary orbit, their infrared sensors constantly scanning American missile fields, submarine patrol zones, and bomber bases. The satellites were designed to detect the bright infrared signature of launching ballistic missiles, the heat bloom from rocket engines that could be seen from space. The theory was elegant. In a nuclear war, minutes would matter. American ICBMs launched from silos in the Midwest would take approximately 30 minutes to reach Moscow. Submarine-launched missiles from closer range might arrive in 10 to 15 minutes. The OKO system was supposed to provide warning time, precious minutes for Soviet leadership to decide how to respond, minutes for Soviet missiles to be launched before American warheads destroyed them in their silos. But there was a problem, one that Petrov knew better than most. The OKO system was new, implemented only the previous year. It was sophisticated but also temperamental. The satellites sometimes produced false alarms, triggered by sunlight reflecting off clouds at certain angles, by the infrared signature of storms, by solar flares, or by electronic glitches in the complex processing algorithms. Petrov had studied these false alarms, had written reports about system vulnerabilities, had advocated for backup systems and additional verification procedures. His superiors had noted his concerns, but also his tendency to question protocols. Petrov was brilliant, but sometimes too independent-minded for the rigid Soviet military hierarchy. He asked uncomfortable questions. He challenged assumptions. This is why, despite his expertise and his role in developing the system, he had not been promoted beyond colonel. This is also why, on the night of September 26, 1983, he was assigned as the officer on duty at Serpukhov 15's command post, a shift he normally wouldn't have worked, filling in for a colleague who was ill. As Petrov arrived at the bunker that evening, the autumn air was crisp and cool. He descended into the installation, passing through security checkpoints, his credentials scrutinized by guards who knew him by sight, but followed protocol nonetheless. He entered the command center, a large room filled with computer consoles, displays, and the quiet hum of electronic equipment. Banks of screens showed data from the OCO satellites, tracking the status of American missile sites, displaying orbital paths, presenting raw sensor data that was processed by the system's computers into actionable intelligence. Around him sat a dozen subordinates, operators, technicians, communications officers, all specialists in their own right, but all ultimately accountable to Petrov during this shift. The atmosphere was professional but relaxed. This was, after all, a routine shift. For years they had monitored the screens, watching for an attack that never came, running drills, responding to false alarms that were quickly identified as such. The boredom of the Cold War, hours of tedium punctuated by occasional moments of concern that always resolved into nothing. Petrov settled into the command chair, reviewed the status reports, and prepared for what he expected would be an uneventful night. The computers hummed, the satellites orbited, the world turned. And in Washington, Moscow, London, and 1,000 other places, people went about their lives, unaware that in a secret bunker south of Moscow, the machinery designed to detect the end of the world was watching, waiting, scanning the darkness for the bright bloom of Holocaust. The stage was set, the systems were armed, the world balanced on a knife's edge between peace and extinction. And in less than an hour, everything would change. At approximately 12:15 a.m. Moscow time, the computers at Serpukhov 15 began to scream. The piercing alarm shattered the quiet routine of the night shift. Every head in the command center snapped toward the main display screen. There, in letters that seemed to burn with urgency, the system announced, "Launch." The OCO satellite system had detected the infrared signature of a ballistic missile lifting off from an American ICBM base. Petrov felt his heart rate spike, but forced himself to remain calm. This had happened before, false alarms triggered by various factors. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the data streaming across multiple displays. His subordinates looked to him, waiting for direction, their faces reflecting the sudden tension that had filled the room. "Report," Petrov ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. "Give me full details." An operator called out, "Single missile launch detected from Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. Confidence level, highest. System assessment, genuine launch. Malmstrom, one of America's 3 ICBM bases, home to 200 Minuteman III missiles, each capable of carrying 3 nuclear warheads. But only 1 missile detected?" Petrov's analytical mind immediately flagged this as odd. American nuclear doctrine, as far as Soviet intelligence understood it, called for massive retaliation in any nuclear exchange. If the Americans were truly launching a first strike, they wouldn't send 1 missile. They would send hundreds, perhaps thousands, attempting to destroy Soviet nuclear forces before they could respond. Still, protocol was clear. Petrov picked up the direct phone line to the Soviet General Staff, the military commanders who would relay any attack warning to the Politburo and to General Secretary Andropov himself. But before he could speak, before he could report the detection, the alarm sounded again. "Launch, launch." Now the screen showed not 1 but 2 missiles, then 3, then 4, then 5. 5 American ICBMs, according to the OCO system, were climbing out of their silos and arcing toward the Soviet Union. The computer's assessment was unequivocal. This was a genuine attack. The confidence level remained at the highest tier. All the technical indicators suggested this was not a false alarm, but the beginning of nuclear war. The command center erupted in controlled chaos. Operators were cross-checking data, running verification protocols, pulling up satellite telemetry. The communications officer was preparing to establish emergency links with Moscow. The alarm continued its insistent wail, a sound designed to cut through any distraction, to focus every mind on the existential threat now facing the nation. Petrov stared at the screen, his mind racing through possibilities. 5 missiles. still far short of the overwhelming first strike Soviet planners expected from the Americans. But 5 missiles could still kill millions. 5 missiles aimed at Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and other major cities could decapitate Soviet leadership and destroy command and control infrastructure. Was this the opening salvo, with more to follow? Or was this some kind of limited strike designed to destroy specific targets? Time to impact? Petrov asked. Approximately 23 minutes, Comrade Colonel, an operator responded. Assuming trajectory toward Moscow region. 23 minutes. Not much time. Soviet doctrine called for immediate notification of any missile launch detection. The information would flow up the chain of command, from Serpukov 15 to the General Staff, from the General Staff to the Defense Minister and the Politburo, ultimately to General Secretary Andropov. Based on that warning, Soviet nuclear forces would be ordered to launch their own missiles in a retaliatory strike, the fundamental principle of mutually assured destruction. Launch on warning. Fire back before your own missiles are destroyed in their silos. Guarantee that even if your nation is annihilated, your enemy will be too. The phone to the General Staff was in Petrov's hand. All he had to do was relay the report. 5 American ICBMs detected. Confidence highest. Impact in 23 minutes. The officers on the other end would take it from there. In bunkers and command posts across the Soviet Union, missile launch officers would receive their orders. Keys would turn in synchronized locks. Buttons would be pressed. 6,000 Soviet warheads would begin their own terrible journey toward American cities. But Petrov didn't make the call. Something was wrong. His intuition, honed by years of working with computer systems and studying their failures, was screaming at him that this didn't make sense. 5 missiles. Why 5? It wasn't enough for a decapitation strike, taking out Soviet leadership, because 5 warheads couldn't guarantee destruction of hardened command bunkers scattered across the USSR. It wasn't a counterforce strike aimed at destroying Soviet missiles, because that would require hundreds of warheads to target Soviet ICBM fields effectively. 5 missiles was militarily illogical. If America was going to start World War III, they wouldn't do it with 5 missiles. They would do it with everything they had, attempting to destroy as much of the Soviet arsenal as possible before it could be launched. The Americans weren't stupid. They knew Soviet doctrine called for launch on warning. They knew that any attack would trigger massive retaliation. So if they were really attacking, it would be overwhelming. Not this trickle of missiles. Check the satellite status, Petrov ordered. Are all sensors functioning normally? An operator worked his console, pulling up diagnostic data. Satellite reports nominal function, Comrade Colonel. All systems green. But Petrov knew the satellites were finicky. He had written reports about their vulnerabilities. He knew that under certain atmospheric conditions, sunlight reflecting off clouds could produce infrared signatures similar to missile launches. He knew that the computer algorithms, while sophisticated, could misinterpret data. He knew that the system was new and hadn't been through enough real-world testing to be completely reliable. He also knew something else. Ground-based radar stations should be able to confirm the missile launches. The OCO satellites were the early warning system, but the Soviet Union also had a network of powerful radar installations that could track incoming missiles once they rose above the horizon. If 5 American ICBMs were really airborne, radar should be starting to detect them by now. Get me radar confirmation, Petrov ordered. I want ground station verification of these launches. The communications officer worked his console, establishing contact with Soviet early warning radar sites. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The alarm continued its wail. The screens continued to show 5 missiles in flight, now 17 minutes from impact, according to the computer's calculations. Petrov's subordinates were looking at him with increasing anxiety. They knew protocol. They knew that the colonel was supposed to have already reported the attack to Moscow. With each passing second, with each moment of hesitation, Petrov was gambling that his intuition was correct, gambling that the system was wrong, gambling with the survival of the Soviet Union and potentially the whole world. Because if this was a real attack and Petrov didn't report it, those 5 warheads would hit their targets. Soviet leadership might be killed. Command and control might be destroyed. The ability to mount an effective retaliation might be compromised. If this was real and Petrov waited, he would be responsible for failing to protect his country. He would be a traitor, the man who allowed the motherland to be destroyed. Court-martial would be the least of his concerns. But if he reported it, and it was false, he would be the man who triggered World War III over a computer glitch. He would be the man who sent 6,000 Soviet warheads against American cities, killing hundreds of millions of people, all because of a false alarm. Even if the Americans didn't actually launch, even if somehow the retaliation could be stopped before Soviet missiles reached their targets, the international consequences would be catastrophic. At minimum, the incident would push the world into a crisis that could spiral into actual war. The communications officer's voice cut through Petrov's thoughts. "Comrade Colonel, radar stations report negative contact. They are not detecting any missiles." Petrov felt a surge of vindication mixed with relief. Negative contact? Are they sure? "Yes, Comrade Colonel. Multiple radar installations report no inbound missiles detected. They should be visible to radar by now if they were real." There it was, the confirmation Petrov's intuition had been screaming for. The satellites said missiles were in the air. The radar said the skies were empty. Someone was wrong, and Petrov was betting everything that it was the satellites. But the alarm still wailed. The screens still showed 5 missiles, now 14 minutes from impact, and Petrov still hadn't reported the attack to Moscow. His subordinates were practically vibrating with tension. The regulations were clear. The protocol was explicit. Yet their commander sat there, phone in hand, not making the call that doctrine demanded. "Comrade Colonel," one of the operators said, his voice tight with stress, "the system shows highest confidence. We should report." "I know what the system shows," Petrov cut him off, more sharply than he intended. He took a breath, moderating his tone. "I also know this system has given false alarms before. I helped design it. I know its weaknesses. But 5 missiles. 5 missiles doesn't make sense." Petrov's voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "Think about it. If the Americans attack, they attack with everything. This is either a false alarm or the least competent nuclear first strike in history." Another operator chimed in. "Perhaps it is a test, Comrade Colonel, to see how we respond?" Petrov shook his head. "A test that risks accidentally triggering a real war? That kills millions if we retaliate? Number. The Americans may be our enemies, but they're not insane." Still, doubt gnawed at him. What if he was wrong? What if this was some new American strategy, some doctrine he didn't know about? What if the 5 missiles were just the beginning, with more to follow? What if radar was experiencing its own technical problems and couldn't detect the missiles? The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. 12 minutes to impact. 11. 10. The alarm maintained its relentless howl. Petrov's hand was white-knuckled on the phone. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air of the underground bunker. Around him, his subordinates maintained their posts, but he could see the fear in their eyes, the questions they wanted to ask but didn't dare. The weight of the moment pressed down on Petrov like a physical force. In his hands, quite literally, rested the fate of the world. If he made the wrong call, if he either failed to report a real attack or reported a false one, the consequences would be beyond comprehension. Cities erased in nuclear fire, millions dead in seconds, the fabric of human civilization torn apart by weapons that could incinerate countries. He thought of his wife, his children, asleep in their apartment in Moscow. If these missiles were real, they might be among the first to die. If he reported it and triggered retaliation against a false alarm, he would be consigning American families, wives, children, innocents who had no say in the policies of their government, to the same fate. How could one man make such a decision? How could anyone bear that responsibility? Yet someone had to decide. The system couldn't do it. The computer was a machine, following its programming, analyzing sensor data and reaching conclusions based on algorithms. The politicians couldn't do it. They were asleep in their beds, unaware of the crisis unfolding 60 miles away. The other officers in the bunker couldn't do it. They were waiting for their commander to make the call. It had to be Petrov. Right here, right now, in this moment, him alone. He made his decision. "Log this as a false alarm," Petrov said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Equipment malfunction. We are not reporting an attack to the general staff." The command center went silent, except for the alarm. Every person in the room stared at their colonel as if he had just announced he could fly. An operator found his voice first. "Comrade Colonel, the protocols." "I know the protocols," Petrov said, with a calm he didn't feel. "I also know this system. Something is wrong with the detection. This is not a real attack." He paused, then added with more force. "That is my assessment, and that is what will be logged. Is that understood?" A chorus of hesitant, "Yes, Comrade Colonel," responses came from around the room. But Petrov could see the doubt in their faces. They thought he was making a catastrophic mistake. Some were probably already wondering how they would explain this to investigators when the warheads hit and Moscow burned. Others were perhaps considering whether they should try to bypass him, call the general staff themselves. "Silence that alarm," Petrov ordered. An operator reached for his console, and the piercing wail cut off, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The sudden quiet was almost as jarring as the noise had been. Petrov stood from his chair and walked to the main display screen, studying the data. The missiles, or rather, the Phantom missiles, were now supposedly 7 minutes from impact. But there they were, on the screen, 5 distinct trajectories, computer-generated tracks showing their path from Montana towards Soviet territory. The system was so certain. The confidence level never wavered. To the computer, this was absolutely unquestionably real. But computers could be wrong. Petrov knew this in a way that many military officers, trained to trust technology and follow procedures, did not. He had worked with these systems at the code level. He had seen how algorithms could produce certainty from ambiguous data. He had studied false alarms and traced them back to their roots. Sensor glitches, processing errors, atmospheric phenomena that mimicked the signatures the system was designed to detect. "Give me the raw satellite data," Petrov said. An operator brought it up on a secondary screen. Petrov studied the infrared signatures, the timing, the intensity curves. His trained eye looked for anomalies, for patterns that might indicate a technical malfunction, rather than actual missile launches. And there was something. The infrared signatures were strong, yes, but they were also oddly uniform. Real missile launches would show variation in signature strength depending on the angle of observation, the stage of the rocket firing, atmospheric conditions. These signatures looked almost too perfect, too textbook, exactly what the system's algorithms were programmed to recognize as missile launches. "This looks like the system is seeing what it expects to see," Petrov muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Pattern recognition locked onto a false positive. "Comrade Colonel?" an operator asked. Petrov turned to face his team. "The satellite sensors are likely picking up sunlight reflecting off cloud formations at a particular angle. The processing algorithms are interpreting that as missile signatures because that's what they're designed to do. But look," he gestured at the screen, "the signatures are too uniform, and radar shows nothing. If missiles were really airborne, radar would have acquired them by now." A communications officer spoke up, his voice nervous. "Comrade Colonel, with respect, what if the radar installations are experiencing their own technical problems? What if they're failing to detect missiles that are actually there?" It was a reasonable question, one that Petrov had already considered. "Possible but unlikely," he said. Multiple independent radar installations would all have to be failing simultaneously in the same way. The probability of that is much lower than the probability of the satellite system giving us a false alarm, which it has done before, as we all know. 5 minutes to supposed impact. If the missiles were real, nuclear warheads were now descending towards Soviet territory, beginning their terminal phase, becoming impossible to intercept even if the Soviet Union had effective missile defenses, which it didn't, not in 1983. In 5 minutes, cities might start to die. Petrov walked back to his command chair and sat down, trying to project a confidence he only partially felt. The truth was, he couldn't be 100% certain. Nobody could be, not in this moment. But certainty wasn't the standard. He had to make a judgment call based on the best available information, analyzed through the lens of his experience and expertise. The best available information said 5 missiles didn't make military sense. The radar showed nothing. The satellite signatures looked artificially uniform. The OCO system had produced false alarms before, under conditions involving unusual solar and atmospheric phenomena. Therefore, this was most likely another false alarm, and reporting it as a genuine attack would risk triggering a nuclear war over a computer glitch. But most likely wasn't certainty. There was still a chance, small but non-zero, that this was real, that Petrov's analysis was wrong, that in a few minutes nuclear weapons would detonate over Soviet cities. If that happened, Petrov would be seen as the man who failed his country at the moment of ultimate crisis. His name would be cursed, his family shamed, his memory reviled, if he survived, which he probably wouldn't if this was a real attack. 3 minutes to supposed impact. Petrov's hands were clenched on the armrests of his chair. Around him, operators maintained their stations, but several were watching him more than their screens. They were young, most of them, trained to follow orders, to trust the system. And here was their colonel, overriding both doctrine and technology, based on nothing more than intuition and analysis that he couldn't definitively prove. Petrov thought about Andropov, the Soviet leader, former KGB chief, convinced that the West was preparing for war. Andropov, who had initiated Operation Ryan, precisely because he believed NATO was planning a nuclear first strike. Andropov, who was seriously ill and might not be thinking with complete clarity. If Petrov called right now and reported missile launches, would Andropov hesitate? Would he demand additional confirmation? Or would he, primed by paranoia and genuine fear, immediately order retaliation? Petrov thought about the young Soviet missile officers in their own bunkers, their own command posts, scattered across the USSR. If the order came to launch, they would follow it. They were trained to follow it. The system was designed so that no single person could stop retaliation once it was ordered. That was the point, to ensure that even if NATO destroyed Soviet leadership, the retaliatory strike would still go forward. Launch on warning, guaranteed retaliation, mutual assured destruction. One call from Petrov might set all of that in motion. One report of an attack might be the spark that ignited the Holocaust. 2 minutes to supposed impact. "Comrade Colonel," an operator said quietly, should we take cover?" If nuclear warheads were about to hit nearby, the underground bunker offered some protection. But Petrov shook his head. "No. Maintain your stations. This is a false alarm." He said it with conviction, forcing certainty into his voice even as doubt continued to gnaw at the back of his mind. Leadership required projecting confidence, especially in moments of crisis. His subordinates needed to believe their colonel knew what he was doing, even if that colonel was himself wrestling with uncertainty. 1 minute to supposed impact. Petrov stared at the screen, watching the countdown. The missiles, or the ghost missiles, the phantom missiles, the figments of a confused computer system, continued their inexorable approach. The trajectories led to Moscow, Leningrad, military installations. The system still showed highest confidence. The computer was certain. But Petrov wasn't listening to the computer anymore. He was listening to his training, his experience, his analytical mind that had studied these systems and understood their weaknesses. He was listening to the evidence, the lack of radar confirmation, the illogical number of missiles, the too perfect infrared signatures. 30 seconds to supposed impact. The command center was utterly silent. Everyone was watching the screen now, watching the countdown, watching to see if their colonel was right or if he had just doomed them all. 15 seconds. Petrov felt a strange calm settle over him. He had made his decision. He had used every tool at his disposal: technology, analysis, experience, judgment, to reach the best conclusion he could. If he was wrong, he would be wrong, and there was nothing more he could do about it now. The die was cast. The decision was made. 10 seconds. 5, 0. Impact time. The moment when, if the missiles were real, nuclear warheads would be detonating over Soviet territory. The moment when the world would change forever, when the Cold War would become nuclear war, when history would split into before and after. The command center remained silent. The screens showed the impact points, but there were no detonations, no flash of nuclear fire, no shock waves racing outward from ground zero, no electromagnetic pulses frying electronic equipment, no communication breakdowns as cities died. Nothing. The bunker's communication systems remained active. Radio contact with Moscow continued normally. No reports of nuclear detonations came flooding in. The world continued to exist, exactly as it had 5 minutes before. Petrov let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Around him, he could see his subordinates doing the same, relief washing over their faces. They had been braced for the end of the world, and the world had not ended. False alarm, Petrov said unnecessarily now. As I assessed, log it as equipment malfunction. I want a full technical analysis of what caused the erroneous detection, but that will be for the day shift. For now, return to normal monitoring. The operators returned to their consoles, but the atmosphere in the command center had changed. The tension was draining away, replaced by a kind of exhausted relief. They had stood at the edge of the abyss and stepped back. They had faced the possibility of nuclear war, and it had proved to be illusion, a trick of light and computers. But Petrov knew the danger wasn't entirely past. He still had to report the incident, not as a missile attack, but as a false alarm. He picked up the phone to the general staff and made his report. This is Serpakov 15. We experienced a false alarm in the early warning system at approximately 00:15 hours. The OCO satellite system incorrectly detected 5 ICBM launches from the United States. Ground-based radar showed no corresponding detections. Assessment: equipment malfunction, cause unknown. No genuine attack occurred. Situation is normal. The officer on the other end of the line asked several questions, which Petrov answered matter-of-factly. Yes, the system had shown highest confidence. No, there was no radar confirmation. Yes, he was certain it was a false alarm. No, he had not reported it as a genuine attack precisely because of the lack of radar confirmation and the illogical nature of only 5 missiles. Petrov could hear the uncertainty in the general staff officer's voice. This was irregular. The protocol said that such detections should be reported immediately, and the decision about whether it was real or false should be made by higher command, not by a colonel in a bunker. By not reporting it immediately, Petrov had violated procedure. He had usurped authority that wasn't technically his. But what could they say? He had been right. The attack wasn't real. Petrov had made the correct call. If he had followed protocol and reported it immediately as a genuine attack, the resulting chaos could have been catastrophic. So the general staff officer noted the report and said the incident would be reviewed. Petrov hung up the phone and returned to his monitoring duties. The rest of the shift passed without incident. The screens remained calm. The satellites continued their orbits. The computers hummed. Dawn broke over the Soviet Union, and with it came the day shift. Fresh officers and operators who would take over the monitoring while Petrov and his team went home to sleep. As Petrov left the bunker that morning, emerging into autumn sunlight, he felt the weight of what had almost happened. Not just the near miss of the false alarm itself, but what might have occurred if he had made a different decision. If he had followed protocol and reported an attack. If that report had reached Andropov and the Politburo. If Soviet nuclear forces had been ordered to retaliate. The world had come within minutes, perhaps within a single phone call, of nuclear war. Not because of deliberate action by either superpower, but because of a computer glitch, a satellite malfunction, a false reading that could have been interpreted as the beginning of World War III, and only because one colonel had decided to trust his judgment over his computers, to analyze the situation rather than simply relay the data, had disaster been averted. Petrov drove home to Moscow, the morning traffic beginning to build, people heading to work, children walking to school, the ordinary routines of life continuing exactly as they always had. None of them knew. None of them would ever know how close they had come to extinction, how their continued existence had hinged on a decision made by a man whose name they would never learn. Stanislav Petrov arrived home, greeted his wife, and went to bed. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the stress of the shift. And while he slept, the investigation into the false alarm began. In the days following the incident, technical teams descended on Serpukov 15 to investigate what had caused the false alarm. They pulled data logs, analyzed satellite telemetry, examined the computer algorithms, and interviewed the officers on duty that night. What they discovered was both simple and terrifying in its implications. The false alarm had been caused by a rare confluence of factors: sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds at a precise angle, combined with the satellite's orbital position at that moment. The OCO system's infrared sensors, designed to detect the heat signature of launching missiles, had instead detected the reflected sunlight. The computer algorithms, programmed to recognize certain patterns as missile launches, had locked onto these signatures and classified them with highest confidence. It was exactly the kind of scenario Petrov had warned about in his reports. The system was sophisticated, but not infallible. It could be fooled by natural phenomena under the right, or rather, wrong, conditions. The investigators confirmed that no missiles had been launched. Petrov's assessment had been correct. His decision not to report an attack had been the right one. But the Soviet military hierarchy didn't see it that way. Petrov was called before his superiors for a formal review of his actions. He expected, perhaps naively, some acknowledgement that he had prevented a potential catastrophe. Instead, he faced criticism for violating protocol. The regulations were clear. Any detection of a missile launch, regardless of confidence level, was to be reported immediately to the General Staff. The decision about whether it constituted a genuine attack was not his to make. It was supposed to be made by higher command, ultimately by the political leadership. By failing to report the detection immediately, Petrov had broken the chain of command. He had usurped authority. Even if his judgment had proven correct, even if he had potentially prevented a nuclear war, he had done so by violating the rules that governed the early warning system. The military leadership was in a difficult position. They couldn't publicly commend Petrov without acknowledging that the OCO system, a multi-billion ruble investment, a cornerstone of Soviet strategic defense, had nearly caused a catastrophic false report of attack. They couldn't promote him or give him a medal without drawing attention to the incident, which remained highly classified. The Politburo didn't want the Soviet people, or the world, to know how close they had come to nuclear war over a computer glitch. Moreover, there was the question of precedent. If Petrov was praised for violating protocol, what message would that send to other officers in the early warning system? That they should trust their judgment over their instruments? That they should question computer data instead of reporting it? The entire early warning system depended on rapid, unquestioning transmission of data up the chain of command. Individual officers weren't supposed to make judgment calls about whether an attack was real or not. Yet the military leadership also couldn't punish Petrov too severely. He had, after all, been correct. And his technical analysis, his reasoning about why 5 missiles didn't make military sense, his insistence on radar confirmation, his knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities, all of that had been sound. A court-martial would have been difficult to justify and might have raised uncomfortable questions about why such an obviously competent officer was being punished for good judgment. So the leadership chose a third path. They did nothing. Or more precisely, they did very little. Petrov received a reprimand for incomplete paperwork. His incident report, filed after the false alarm, had apparently not documented every detail to the satisfaction of his superiors. It was a bureaucratic slap on the wrist, a face-saving measure that allowed the military to formally discipline him without acknowledging the real issue at hand. More significantly, Petrov's career was quietly frozen. There would be no more promotions. He would not be advanced to command positions of greater authority. The military made it clear, without ever explicitly saying so, that Petrov's willingness to question the system, to trust his judgment over protocol, made him unsuitable for advancement. Petrov understood the message. He was too independent-minded, too willing to think for himself, too much the engineer and not enough the obedient soldier. The Soviet military system valued compliance and protocol adherence. It did not value officers who made unauthorized judgment calls, even if those judgment calls saved the world. The incident itself was classified at the highest level. The officers present that night were ordered never to discuss it. No public announcement was made. Soviet military doctrine and procedures were quietly reviewed, and some changes were implemented to reduce the likelihood of similar false alarms. But these were done without fanfare or explanation. As far as the Soviet people knew, as far as the world knew, nothing had happened on September 26, 1983. Just another day in the Cold War. Just another night of routine monitoring at installations whose existence was secret and whose purpose was to watch for an apocalypse that never came. But for those who knew, the officers at Serpukhov 15, the military leadership, the technical teams who investigated, September 26th was the night they had nearly sleepwalked into nuclear war. It was the night when only one man's refusal to follow protocol had stood between humanity and extinction. Petrov continued his duties at Serpukhov 15, but the joy had gone out of his work. He had saved the world and received a reprimand for his troubles. His warnings about system vulnerabilities had been validated in the most dramatic way possible, yet little was done to address them. He felt increasingly disillusioned with the military bureaucracy, with a system that valued procedural compliance over critical thinking. Meanwhile, the Cold War continued its dangerous dance. 6 weeks after Petrov's incident, NATO conducted the Able Archer 83 exercise, the very exercise that had Soviet intelligence convinced an attack was imminent. Soviet forces went on high alert. Nuclear-armed aircraft were readied. For 10 days in November 1983, the world unknowingly stood on the same precipice it had faced in September. Except this time, Soviet leadership was aware of the crisis. Years later, after the Cold War ended and documents were declassified, historians would learn just how dangerous Able Archer 83 had been. The Soviets had genuinely believed that NATO might be preparing to launch a nuclear strike under cover of the exercise. Soviet nuclear forces had been placed on the highest alert they had been at since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Only the fact that NATO was unaware of Soviet fears, and therefore didn't take any actions that could be misinterpreted as preparation for an actual attack, had prevented the situation from escalating. But in the autumn of 1983, nobody in the West knew how close they had come to war. Reagan and other NATO leaders were shocked when they later learned of Soviet fears. The exercise had been routine to them, standard military planning. The idea that it had nearly triggered a nuclear exchange was sobering beyond measure. Petrov, watching these events unfold from his classified bunker, understood better than most how fragile the peace was. The weapons existed to destroy civilization. The warning systems existed to detect attacks. The procedures existed to ensure retaliation. All the machinery of mutually assured destruction was in place, carefully designed and maintained. But that same machinery could fail in unexpected ways. A satellite could misinterpret sunlight. A computer could produce false confidence in erroneous data. Paranoid leaders could misread routine exercises as preparation for war. And when that happened, everything depended on individual human beings making the right decisions in moments of extreme stress with incomplete information. Petrov had been fortunate. His technical knowledge and analytical mind had allowed him to recognize the false alarm for what it was. But what if the duty officer that night had been someone else? Someone less familiar with the system's weaknesses? Someone more inclined to follow protocol without question? Someone who trusted the computer's assessment of highest confidence? The answer was too terrible to contemplate, yet Petrov found himself contemplating it often in the months and years that followed. How many other moments like this had there been? How many other times had the world unknowingly stood at the brink, only to step back because of luck or individual judgment? And how many more such moments would there be before luck ran out? In 1984, still disillusioned and feeling undervalued, Petrov took early retirement from the military. He was only 45 years old, but he had lost faith in a system that punished critical thinking and rewarded blind obedience. He left the bunker at Serpukhov 15, left his classified work on early warning systems, and returned to civilian life. He found work at the Research Institute, where he had worked before his military service, doing technical work far removed from nuclear weapons and early warning systems. He lived quietly with his wife, later divorced, and struggled with the same economic difficulties that affected millions of Russians as the Soviet Union began its slow collapse. The Soviet Union itself lasted only a few more years after Petrov's retirement. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, loosened the rigid control of the Communist Party. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Eastern European satellite states broke away, and in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, ending the Cold War and the nuclear standoff that had defined global politics for nearly half a century. As the USSR collapsed, so did much of its military-industrial complex. The early warning systems that Petrov had worked on continued to function, but funding dried up. Maintenance was deferred. Satellites aged without replacement. The vast apparatus of nuclear weapons and warning systems that had consumed so much of Soviet resources gradually decayed. Petrov's life in the new Russia was difficult. His military pension was small and often late. The Research Institute where he worked struggled to stay solvent in the chaos of Russia's transition to capitalism. He lived in a small apartment, far removed from the secret bunkers and classified work of his military years. For more than a decade after the incident, Petrov's story remained unknown. The September 26th false alarm was still classified. The officers who had been present were still bound by secrecy oaths. Petrov himself rarely spoke of it, even to family. It was simply another classified incident in a career filled with classified work. A night when nothing happened because disaster was averted. But in 1998, the story began to emerge. Russian military sources, speaking to researchers compiling a history of the Cold War, mentioned an incident in 1983 when a Soviet early warning officer had prevented a false alarm from triggering a nuclear response. The details were vague, the names initially withheld, but the outlines of the story began to circulate among historians and nuclear weapons experts. Gradually, investigators pieced together what had happened. They tracked down officers who had been at Serpukhov 15 that night. They located technical reports on the false alarm, and eventually, they identified the officer who had made the crucial decision not to report an attack, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. When journalists found Petrov in his modest apartment, he was initially reluctant to discuss the incident. Even after all these years, even with the Soviet Union gone and the Cold War over, he was uncomfortable with attention. He had simply done his job, he said. He had analyzed the data and reached the correct conclusion. There was nothing heroic about it. But as the story became public, others saw it differently. Nuclear weapons experts understood the significance of what Petrov had done. Historians recognized it as one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, a crisis that had never made the news because it had been resolved before escalating. Peace activists embraced Petrov as an example of how one person's courage and clear thinking could change history. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens gave Petrov an award, calling him the man who saved the world. He traveled to the United Nations in New York to receive it, an elderly Russian in a borrowed suit, uncomfortable with the ceremony and the attention. In interviews, he remained modest, even self-deprecating, about his role. "I was just doing my job," he told reporters. "I had the training to understand the system. I knew it could make mistakes, so I made my assessment, that's all." When pressed about whether he felt like a hero, Petrov shook his head. "I don't feel like I did anything special. If I had been a real hero, I would have been the one to create a system that couldn't make such mistakes in the first place." But to those who understood the stakes, to those who knew how close the world had come to nuclear war, how a single phone call from Petrov to the general staff might have set in motion an unstoppable cascade of retaliation, he was indeed a hero. Not because he had fought an enemy or performed some spectacular act of courage, but because in a moment of crisis, when every procedure and protocol told him to do one thing, he had trusted his judgment and done something else. As Stanislav Petrov's story spread through the international community in the early 2000s, it prompted profound reflection on the nuclear age and the systems humanity had built to manage weapons of apocalyptic power. Here was a man who had literally held the fate of civilization in his hands for those agonizing minutes in September 1983, and the world had never known. How many other such moments had there been? How many times had humanity unknowingly depended on the judgment of individual officers, radar operators, submarine captains, making split-second decisions that could trigger or prevent Armageddon? The answers, as researchers delved deeper into Cold War history, were sobering. Petrov's incident was not unique. It was simply one that had come to light. There had been other false alarms, other moments when the early warning systems of the superpowers had detected attacks that weren't happening. In 1979, a training tape loaded into NORAD computers had convinced American officers that a massive Soviet attack was underway until someone realized the mistake. In 1980, a faulty computer chip had caused U.S. systems to show incoming missiles. In 1995, years after the Cold War ended, a Norwegian scientific rocket was mistaken by Russian radars for an American nuclear missile, and President Boris Yeltsin had actually activated his nuclear briefcase before the error was recognized. Each time, disaster had been averted by human judgment, by verification procedures, by luck. The nuclear command and control systems, designed to ensure swift retaliation in case of attack, had proven vulnerable to false positives, to misinterpreted data, to technical glitches. And each time, someone, an officer, an analyst, a commander, had made the right call, had demanded confirmation, had questioned the computers. But each time was also a roll of the dice. What if the wrong person had been on duty? What if the false alarm had been more convincing? What if verification systems had also failed? What if political tensions had been even higher than they were? Petrov's story became a case study in nuclear weapons courses, in military academies, in diplomatic training programs. It illustrated both the incredible responsibility placed on individuals within nuclear command structures and the systemic vulnerabilities of early warning systems. It showed how even the most sophisticated technology could fail in unexpected ways, and how human judgment remained the ultimate safeguard against accidental nuclear war. But for Petrov himself, the attention was bittersweet. By the time his story became widely known, he was in his 60s, living on a meager pension in a small town outside Moscow. His wife had died. His son had died. His health was failing. The international recognition came too late to change the trajectory of his life, to undo the career stagnation and economic hardship that had followed his retirement from the military. When documentary filmmakers came to interview him, they found a man who was thoughtful and analytical, still clearly intelligent despite his age, but also lonely and somewhat bitter about how his life had turned out. He spoke matter-of-factly about the incident, walking through the technical details with the precision of the engineer he had always been. But when asked about the aftermath, the reprimand, the frozen career, the lack of recognition, a note of sadness entered his voice. "I did what I thought was right," he told one interviewer. "I used my training and my knowledge to analyze the situation. I concluded it was a false alarm, and I was correct. But in the Soviet military, that didn't matter as much as following procedures. They valued obedience more than critical thinking." He paused, then added, "Maybe they were right to. Maybe it's too dangerous to have individual officers making such decisions. Maybe the system should be designed so that nobody has to make such a choice. But that wasn't the system we had. So I made the choice, and I have to live with it, though of course the alternative would have been much worse." Despite the international awards and recognition, the Russian government never officially acknowledged Petrov's role in preventing nuclear war. There was no state medal, no formal commendation from the Russian military. The incident remained a source of embarrassment, a reminder that Soviet early warning systems had nearly triggered a catastrophic error, that the Oko satellite network had been dangerously unreliable, that the rigid Soviet military culture had almost contributed to the end of the world. Petrov told one interviewer, "I don't need the Russian government to tell me I did the right thing. I know I did. But it would be nice if they acknowledged that the system needed improvement, that we were too dependent on technology that wasn't ready, that we placed too much responsibility on individual officers without giving them the authority to make proper judgments." In 2006, Petrov was invited to speak at various conferences and educational institutions around the world. He traveled, despite his poor health, motivated partly by financial need. The honorariums helped supplement his small pension, but also by a genuine desire to share lessons from his experience. He spoke at the United Nations, at universities, at peace conferences. Everywhere he went, audiences listened with rapt attention to this elderly Russian man who had once held human civilization in his hands. His message was consistent. The nuclear weapons systems built during the Cold War were more fragile and more prone to catastrophic error than the public realized. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction depended on perfectly functioning warning systems and rational decision-making under extreme stress. But warning systems were imperfect, and human beings under stress made mistakes. The combination was terrifyingly dangerous. "We built these weapons to deter war," Petrov would say. "The theory was that because they were so terrible, nobody would dare use them. But then we built systems to use them automatically, to launch on warning, because we were afraid that if we waited for confirmation, it would be too late. We created a situation where a computer error could end the world, and only human judgment stood in the way. That's not deterrence, that's insanity." He advocated for nuclear disarmament, though he was realistic about the difficulties. The weapons existed. The knowledge to build them couldn't be unlearned. But he argued that the world needed to step back from launch-on-warning policies, needed to build in more safeguards, needed to reduce the likelihood that false alarms could trigger actual nuclear exchanges. "I was lucky," he would tell audiences. "I had the technical knowledge to recognize the false alarm. I had the confidence to trust my judgment over the computers. I had the authority, in that moment, to make the call. But you can't design a system that depends on luck. You can't build a structure that assumes you'll always have the right person in the right place at the right time. Sooner or later, if you have enough close calls, one of them won't be averted." His audiences, students, military officers, diplomats, peace activists, listened to his message, but Petrov was under no illusion that he was changing policy. The nuclear weapons remained. The early warning systems continued to operate. The doctrines that had brought the world to the brink in 1983 had been modified, but not fundamentally changed. The United States and Russia still maintained thousands of nuclear weapons, many of them on high alert, ready to launch within minutes of a warning. "I did what I could," Petrov said in one of his last major interviews. "I made one good decision on one night in 1983. I can't change the whole world. I can't eliminate nuclear weapons by myself. All I can do is tell my story and hope that people learn from it. Hope that politicians and military leaders understand how close we came. Hope that they make better decisions than we did, better systems than we built." In his final years, Petrov lived quietly in Fryazino, a town northeast of Moscow. He gave fewer interviews, his health declining with age. The initial flurry of international attention faded. New crises emerged, new threats, new fears. The Cold War seemed like ancient history to younger generations. The idea of nuclear war between the United States and Russia seemed almost quaint, a relic of a bygone era, even though both nations still maintained arsenals capable of destroying human civilization. Petrov watched the world change around him. The Soviet Union that he had served was gone. The rigid certainties of the Cold War had given way to a more complex, multipolar world. But the nuclear weapons remained, and new nuclear powers had emerged: India, Pakistan, North Korea, bringing their own tensions and crises. The threat of nuclear war hadn't disappeared, it had simply evolved. On May 19, 2017, Stanislav Petrov died in his apartment in Fryazino. He was 77 years old. Due to a bureaucratic error or simple neglect, his death was not reported for several months. When news finally emerged in September 2017, tributes poured in from around the world. Nuclear weapons experts mourned him as the man who had prevented World War III. Peace activists praised his courage and his advocacy for disarmament. Former military officers from various nations acknowledged the impossible burden he had carried and the wisdom he had shown. But in Russia, the official response was muted. There was no state funeral, no ceremony at the Kremlin, no acknowledgement from President Putin. The Russian military issued no statement. The Ministry of Defense remained silent. Petrov died as he had lived his post-Soviet years, largely forgotten by his own government, honored by foreigners who understood what he had done, but never fully recognized at home. His grave is simple, marked with a modest headstone. No military honors, no elaborate memorial, no indication that buried there is the man who, on one September night in 1983, had saved the world. Just a name and dates: Stanislav Petrov, 1939 to 2017. Yet his legacy endures in unexpected ways. His story is taught in military academies as an example of critical thinking under pressure. It's studied in political science courses as a case study in nuclear deterrence and its failures. It's told in ethics classes as an example of moral courage in the face of protocol and hierarchy. It's shared by peace activists as a warning about the dangers of nuclear weapons and automated war systems. And perhaps most importantly, his story serves as a reminder of something we often forget in our technological age: that at crucial moments, human judgment matters. Systems and procedures and protocols are important, but they are not infallible. Computers and algorithms can provide data, but they cannot provide wisdom. In the end, there are moments when someone must decide, must take responsibility, must trust their own analysis, even when every regulation tells them to do otherwise. Petrov was not a superhero. He didn't have extraordinary powers or abilities. He was simply a well-trained, thoughtful officer who understood the systems he worked with and had the confidence to trust his judgment when it mattered most. He was an ordinary man who, through circumstance and character, found himself in an extraordinary situation and made the right call. "I was just doing my job," he said repeatedly throughout his life, deflecting attempts to label him as a hero. but doing your job, when your job is to prevent nuclear war, when doing it wrong could end human civilization, when the protocols tell you one thing and your judgment tells you another, that requires a kind of courage that most people will never face. The footage of Petrov in his later years shows an elderly man, somewhat stooped, wearing simple clothes, living in modest circumstances. He doesn't look like someone who changed history. He looks like someone's grandfather, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance, which is exactly the point. Heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they're simply people who, when faced with an impossible choice in an impossible moment, manage to make the right decision for the right reasons. Sometimes they're people who do their jobs well, under circumstances of extreme stress and uncertainty. Sometimes they're people who question authority when questioning authority might save the world. As the sun sets on archival footage of Petrov, the images fade to scenes from 1983. Cold War tension, military exercises, missile silos, submarines, the infrastructure of potential Armageddon. All of it still existed, still operational, still ready. But on one night in September, all of it had paused, held back by one man's refusal to launch. The world never knew it was saved that night. People went to work the next morning. Children went to school. Families had dinner together. Lovers embraced. Arguments were had. Jokes were told. Life continued in all its ordinary complexity, all because an officer in a bunker made the right call. How many other nights have there been like that? How many other individuals have stood between us and extinction? How many close calls have we never heard about? Crises averted before they could escalate. Decisions made correctly under pressure. We can't know. The systems remain classified. The incidents stay secret. The people who make those decisions often remain anonymous, bound by security oaths, or simply never asked about their experiences. But we know about Stanislav Petrov. We know what he did, and we know that on September 26, 1983, when computer screens showed missiles inbound and protocols demanded immediate retaliation, he said no. He said no to the computers, no to the procedures, no to the fear and pressure of the moment. He looked at the data, applied his knowledge and experience, made his judgment, and chose to trust that judgment over everything else. And because of that choice, that one moment of courage and clarity in a secret bunker south of Moscow, the sun rose the next morning over a world that still existed. Cities that might have been erased still stood. People who might have died in nuclear fire lived to see another day. Children who might never have been born grew up to have children of their own. The man who refused to launch saved the world, not with weapons or warfare, not with grand gestures or heroic battles, but simply by thinking clearly in a moment of crisis, by trusting his training and his judgment, by having the courage to say, "This doesn't make sense," when everyone and everything else was screaming at him to sound the alarm. He died unrecognized by his government, modestly pensioned, living in a small apartment far from the bunker where he had made history. But his story lives on, a reminder of both how fragile our world is and how much depends on the judgment of individual human beings in moments of crisis. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. But the weapons remain. The systems remain. And somewhere, right now, officers are on duty in command centers and bunkers, monitoring early warning systems, watching screens, ready to detect attacks and report them up the chain of command. We hope they're as thoughtful as Stanislav Petrov. We hope they have his training, his analytical mind, his willingness to question data that doesn't make sense. We hope that if they face a moment like his, they'll make the same choice, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate.